In this lesson, all of our pieces are finally coming into place as we're going to deploy our REST API to Azure, connected to our Postgres database that we deployed in the previous lesson, and we're going to connect our client application to the newly deployed REST API so we are able to test the complete DevHabit application. I'll be using the Azure App Service for deploying my .NET application. This is a well-known Azure service that has been running applications in production for many years. Because our application is cross-platform, we can also host it on a Linux server in Azure App Service, and we also have a simple way to deploy our application to an Azure App Service from my local machine, as well as from the CI/CD pipeline. So let's go into the Azure portal and see how we are going to configure this. From the dashboard of the Azure portal, you can go ahead and look for App Services, or if it's not there, then just search for it in the search bar. I'm going to go into the App Services and then I will click Create. And what we want to create is a web application. So I will choose that option. And then let me walk you through the steps for setting up our app service. So for the resource group, I will choose DevHabit. This is where my database is, as well as my client application. Then we have to choose a name. For the app service, I'm going to use DevHabit API. You can decide how you want to publish this from the code or as a container. I'll choose the simpler deployment model from my code, and I'm going to select .NET 9 as my runtime stack. I want to run this on the Linux operating system, and I'll choose West Europe as my region because it's close to where I'm located. Now, when it comes to the pricing plans, I'm going to create a new one. Let's call it ASP DevHabit API. I'll click OK, and then I get to choose which pricing plan I want to use. So let's explore what we have available, and here you can choose the amount of compute and memory you want to use for your application. There's also a free option here if you don't want to pay anything, but it's very limited in amount of compute, and you also don't have the ability to continuously run this application, which means it's going to stop when it goes idle, so I won't be using this option. Now, when it comes to development and test queues, you can see we have some basic instances that are probably going to be good enough for our use case. The cheapest one is the basic B1 instance, which costs about $13 a month, and it comes with one CPU and 1.75 gigabytes of RAM. When you add this together with the cost of our database, we can run this application for just about $30 a month. So Azure definitely isn't the cheapest option out there. If you go for something like DigitalOcean, they also have some offerings where you can host a Postgres instance and the .NET application, and it's going to come out cheaper. However, it's not as widely used, which is why I wanted to focus on Azure. So let me select the basic B1 tier, and this is what I'm going to use for my app service. Now I can click Next and head over to my database setup, but I don't need to do anything here because we already created our database. Now, when it comes to enabling deployment, you can connect your app service to your GitHub repository and automatically deploy the application using GitHub Actions. I won't be doing this here as I want to deploy my code manually, but I will enable basic authentication for deploying my app service. This will allow me to download a publish profile, which I can use later inside of my CI/CD pipeline to easily deploy my .NET application. So let's go into networking. Make sure that public access is turned on so that we can actually reach our REST API from the internet. When it comes to monitoring and security, I want to turn on Application Insights. This is what I will be using as my APM tool, Application Performance Management, and we're going to talk more about this in our next lesson, but I just want to make sure that Application Insights is turned on. And that's all we need to do in this tab. Let's go into tags, which I'm just going to skip, and let's go to Review and Create, where you can check out that all of the settings are properly configured. And if you are happy with this, go ahead and click Create, and this will start setting up your Azure App Service resource. While our app service is being provisioned, let's make a couple of changes to our DevHabit API. What I want to do is to expose my Swagger and Scalar documentation on my API instance so that it's also available even when we aren't running in development. Applying migrations and seeding initial data, I'm going to leave as development only options. I just want to expose my documentation so that we can observe it from our production deployment. Now, when it comes to seeding the initial data, this is also something that we have to take care for our application to be able to work. So I will quickly jump into dbeaver, and I'm going to execute this script, which is going to create my two roles inside of the identity schema. So let me go ahead and execute this. And now the member and admin role will be available for our application when we want to register a new user. If you want to run this yourself, you can find the SQL statement right under this video. Now, if you go back to the Azure portal, we can go into the app service resource. Here we can find the host address where our API is going to be available. So I can copy this value as I'm going to need it for setting up my client application. Now another thing I want to do is go into settings and then configuration. And here I want to make sure that the always on setting is turned on so that my application is always running, because I have some Quartz background jobs that I'm running in the same application. So I'll go ahead and click save and continue, and this should apply my latest setting. Now let's go back to the overview and let's use the host to set up the base address for our client application. So what I'm going to do is set the respective environment variable to point to my app service, which is running inside of Azure, and then I need to build my application again and redeploy it. If you want to be completely on the safe side, you can also delete your previous deployment inside of the this folder, and then you can say SWA build, and this is going to build your application and is going to output the build inside of the this folder. And then I can go ahead and execute SWA deploy, specify the environment as production, and pass in my deployment token. So now this is going to deploy my DevHabit client application to production with the new environment variable, and we should be able to confirm this by doing a simple login and checking that the request is going to the correct address. So our client application is deployed to production. Now let's visit the website, and if I head over to the DevHabit website, specify some dummy email and password, and I open up the network tools and we click sign in, we should see a request to the login endpoint, and we can confirm that it's using the correct root URL for our API. Now all that's left to do is to deploy our application. Back in the Azure portal for our app service, I'm going to head into settings and environment variables, and I want to configure a couple of options before we deploy our application. What I want to do is provide the respective environment variables for running this application in production, and I'm going to choose advanced edit because I want to add them in bulk. So I'm going to copy all of the settings that I want to introduce, and you should recognize most of these values from our app settings files. So here is my database connection string, which is configured to connect to my Postgres database that we deployed in the previous lesson. Another thing I'm doing is configuring my course options by setting the allowed origins to point to our client application. I'm also specifying an encryption key value encrypted as base64, setting the GitHub base URL, how often the GitHub automation should run. I'm also specifying the JSON web token options. I didn't bother with providing a proper key value. This one should be sufficient as this is just a demonstration. And then I'm also configuring my log levels and setting the maximum allowed number of tags. So I'm going to click OK. This is going to create my environment variables, and I'm going to apply them and confirm these changes. So now I should be able to deploy my application, and it's going to pick up on all of these environment variables and connect to the correct services. Now let's jump into Visual Studio. Here I want to deploy my application to Azure using the publish functionality that's available inside of Visual Studio. So I'm going to right-click my project and then hit publish, and it's going to find the GitHub action that I have inside of my repository. However, I want to create a new profile. And for this, I'm going to choose Azure as my deployment target. Then I'll hit next, and I want to use Azure App Service Linux. Here it's going to reach out to Azure and find any app services that I have. And the one that I'm looking for is the DevHabit API. Then I'm going to click next. I'm going to skip API management and click next. And finally, I want to publish this using a publish profile. So I will click finish. This is going to generate a publish profile, and I should be able to use this to deploy my application. So now if I hit publish using my new publish profile, it's going to start the build process, publish my application, and then compress everything into a zip file and finally publish to the Azure App Service. And when this completes, we should see a message that the deployment was successful, and it may attempt to open the root address of the Azure App Service. If you navigate to the root address of your Azure App Service and then type in Swagger, you should be greeted with the Swagger UI screen that contains the API documentation. You can also switch between the API versions that we have, which are version 1 and version 2, and you can see that all of our rich documentation is properly deployed to production. Now I can also go into the Scalar documentation, which contains a bit more polished user interface compared to the Swagger UI, where you can see the documentation for the individual API endpoints. And this is something that you could expose to your clients or consumers. And I think that this type of documentation is quite similar to what you will see with popular services. For example, this doesn't look too different from the GitHub REST API documentation. Now, finally, let's jump into our client application and let's see if the connection to our backend is working. Now, because I don't have a user account, I'm going to click sign up and I'm going to fill in the details and create my account. Now, this may take a couple of moments depending on how fast our API responds, but we should be able to register to our application and you can see that the dashboard is set up. So from here, I can go ahead and create my first habit. Let's call it daily coding. I'll choose measurable as the habit type. The frequency is going to be daily, and let's say 1 time per day is a knife. And let's say I want to do this 1 time per day, and the target value should be 5 hours of coding. I'm happy with this, so I'm going to create my habit. This may take a couple of moments, but my habit is now created. I can go ahead and create my tag. Let's call it coding. I'll create the tag and now I can go back to the habit, click into the habit details, edit the tags of this habit and save the coding tag. So you can definitely see that there is a bit of latency between our client application and the API. This is simply because of the compute instance that we configured for our application. Now I'm going to go back to the habits and create one more, and I want to call this one GitHub integration tracking. It should be measurable, let's say daily. The target value is going to be 1 task, and I'm going to pick GitHub as the automation source and create this habit. Now behind the scenes, my background job is going to pick up this habit and is going to see if I have my GitHub integration configured. Now I currently do not, so I'm going to click configure GitHub integration, paste in the value for my personal access token and then save this, and this should connect me to my GitHub profile. So now the integration can properly fetch my events and add them as entries. Now while we wait for this, let's create a manual entry. In daily coding, I'm going to leave the default value and no notes, and I can create my entry. And now if I go into the dashboard, I should be able to see that I have one activity, which is the one entry that I just created. And this is a quick demo of how our application is working. Now if I open up the network tab and I jump between my screens, you should be able to see how long it takes to get back to response from our API. So fetching the habits is around 100 milliseconds, but if I execute this a couple of more times, I expect the latency to come down. Essentially, you can see that depending on the load on our REST API, the response time can vary. But considering that we're using a pretty basic instance, I think this is quite acceptable and the UI isn't lagging too much. So I'm going to slowly wrap up this lesson where we deployed our REST API to Azure, connected it to our database, and we also configured our client application to connect to the REST API. Our deployment process is still pretty manual and slow. This is something that we're going to improve on. However, we first have to tackle monitoring of our application, and that's what we're going to cover in the next lesson, where I'm going to show you how to introduce monitoring using application insights.